Conscience in Action, Part 4, concluding the experiences from World War II, as we look at the book that was produced by the AACE, the Association of Australian Christadelphian Ecclesias, published in 2007, Conscience in Action, the experience of conscientious objection in Australia. The book is descriptive and exhortational, and in particular comes with some recordings which were produced for the record and for our information, and we reproduce them here. Brother David Pogson shares his experiences and makes the comment that some left the truth later, saying that the long haul is often harder than the shorter trial.
Our preparation for the case was purely personal, and we gained an interview with Brother James Mansfield Sr., who discussed the issues with us at his place, and he at that time was going to the court with the lads, and he would become a witness and give a character witness for them, which he did in my case. I forget the name of the magistrate, but Braun was the prosecutor. Okay, so it went for a few hours. It was a pretty harrowing experience, and I sort of thought I did pretty well, but I only got exempt from competent service. Okay, so then you, when that was over, then you get called up. You have a medical, I think. Yes, I had a medical, somewhere in between there. And then you're called up because to go to the army and you don't go. Then you get called to court for not doing that. And there's not much said. They hand you over to the police, I think it was. It was either military police or police. I think it was police, plainclothes police. With me was a Jehovah's Witness named Emil Mercer. I can't remember most people's names, but I'll never forget his name. He was a Jehovah's Witness. So we were together taken down. I think the building was in Mountain Place, but I'm not sure of that, where the court was. Straight down to a black paddy wagon. And I can remember we'd sitting each side on the benches in the back of the paddy wagon, lock the door, and up you go through the city. The traffic would stop, and people would pass by at the crossings and looking at you as you went by. It was we weren't frightened, but you suddenly, for the first time, realised what it was like to be imprisoned. They took us then directly to the Victoria Barracks, and they brought us behind bars, stone walls, little window up there with a grill, just like a regular prison, But funnily enough, the Jehovah's Witness and I were going flat out on the devil and other subjects. And they had to let you out to go to the toilet and then bring you back and lock you up again. And they brought us round lunch, which was the lunch was tinned fish with a salad. Then a few hours later, they marched us out of that prison into a military police paddy wagon, a khaki paddy wagon, and they drove us out to Ingleburn, where the army training areas were at Ingleburn at that time. I don't remember much about the trip to Ingleburn, but I can remember pulling up at the headquarters of that particular battalion. I forget what battalion it was. Then there's 4 or 6 men with a sergeant major, which is a typical sergeant major, overweight, short, a great big red face, and bellowing it all the time, his orders to his men, okay. And he was ordering these men to take us into the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hewson, an educated gentleman of a very high standard of education, intelligence, but a reputation for being as hard as nails with these men, okay. So they take us with their bayonets fixed and march you into the Lieutenant Colonel, okay. But we were told to salute and whatever, we wouldn't do any of that. I did happen to notice that when I arrived there's a flagpole on the lawn. Around the flagpole there's this little figure squatting on a big piece of timber, weeding a new lawn around the flagpole. It was none other than John Mansfield. So he'd gone before, okay, so he was the first one in there, and he'd been there for some weeks before. Anyway, the Lieutenant Colonel, virtually from memory, indicated that, yeah, we told him, you know, there was a conscientious objector, and I wasn't going to be trained nor take sort of things I wouldn't do. Very nicely, and he was amazingly very nice back. And in the end, he was virtually striking a bargain about what we would do. Okay, so I was a clerk, and I made the mistake of agreeing to. And it was a mistake. I made the mistake of agreeing to doing a bit of typing for the captain's office that looked after all the stores, quartermaster, food mainly, food store, ordering and all that. And so they agreed to that, and they agreed to us not saluting and not obeying any officers, that we'd be directly answerable only to him. And that when there were parades with superior officers arriving over Lieutenant, which happened once or twice every few months, we were told to get lost, okay? So he was very considerate, really. He could have given us a hard time. I worked for a little while in the office, and after a while I realised that it was just too involved, part of the army system, and I said I wasn't prepared to do that anymore. So they sent me out with John Mansfield to look after these new lawns at the entry to the barracks, around the flagpole, playing areas. On the books we were privates, but the commanding officer gave us the privilege of being conscientious objectors, and others that followed were given duties according to their trades, and we didn't have to wear the uniform, but he asked us, or we chose, to wear our own khaki clothes, not to embarrass him. But all the officers knew that we wouldn't salute and who we were. And some of those officers didn't handle their own blokes right. Sometimes you'd walk by with a couple of soldiers, and the soldiers failed to salute, and the officer, the sergeant, whatever, would say to them, "Are you conscientious objectors?" They said, "No." "Well, you salute when you pass me." It was very foolish conduct on their part, you know. Consequently, we weren't too popular with the soldiers at the start, especially we were in for 5.5 months. We had to do our whole period in one lump because we'd defaulted, whereas they were only in for 3 months at a time, then a new lot would come in. As a new lot would come in, they would tend to give us a hard time in the mess. We had to eat with all the soldiers, throw food at you, do all those sort of things. But after they'd been there a while, they sort of got used to us and probably decided we weren't so stupid after all, and used to ask questions about our beliefs. We expected a lot worse. We expected violence and all sorts of things, and that was no problem for us. And the foolish officers used to put us in the front of the mess line and get us fed first, which was a very stupid thing to do. That didn't help us with our relationship with the soldiers. In the end, the soldiers complained, and we had to go on the end of the line and get any food that was left over, which was very sensible, very foolish. The lower officers handled us very foolishly and inadequately. And they probably just said, oh, get up there before the others. The others had to go and parade first. So we could walk straight up and be at the head of the line. And after they'd broken parade, they could come and get their food, you see. So that was just a detail, and we finished up in the back of the line, made no difference, and probably made it easier for us with the soldiers anyway. We were kept away from the other soldiers. We were actually given an officer's hut. You wouldn't believe it. All the other soldiers had a hut where they, in companies of about 40 men. We had this hut broken up into 3 rooms because they were officers' huts, sergeants' huts. And we were told to keep it clean. They have inspections, and the first inspection, the sergeant major come in, and he was going to really give it to us when he got there. Not only everything was clean and the beds made, the floor, which had never happened before, was actually polished with polish. And he looked around, looked at it and said, I wish my own men were like that, and walked out. He never inspected us anymore. Yes, and we respected them and gave them full respect and never challenged them, but they were under directions from their commanding officer and they wouldn't dare break that. But they saw we were so cooperative, they just didn't worry us anymore. We had a lot of interesting experience with soldiers. Like, there was, in my room, there was John Mansfield, myself, Arthur, these are all brethren, Brother Arthur Wright, Keith Leadbeater, and Jack Hatter, I think it was, from Granville. They, on the books, were privates, and they tried to pay us, and we wouldn't receive the pay. The Jehovah's Witnesses took the pay. After we went in, Jehovah's Witnesses started to arrive in considerable numbers, and they took up the other 2 rooms in that hut. There was some good one amongst them, but most of them were very worldly people. They embarrassed us dreadfully at times. They would go AWL to go down to the hotel. They would, in the end, when Emil left, who was their leader, the one that came in with me, they would have nude drawings of women up on their wall. You can imagine how embarrassing that was for us, because they would just relate us all as one, you know. So there were some good ones amongst them, but a lot of them were terrible worldlings, you know. But we were always debating with them, and that was probably a good occupation anyway. They decided, the conscientious objectors decided once they'd have a foot race, 100-yard foot race. And Brother John Mansfield, who was always busy making out circulars for his Captain Salmon customers' shops and posting them out, said a race. He rolled up his long trousers, went outside and beat the lot by yards. So there were some funny things that happened. And the Christadelphian boys did their readings and had an Ecclesias class in their own room. We did have a couple of JW in with us, but he was a good one. And a Tolstoy, I think it was Tolstoy. He was a conscientious objector. And he came from way out west. He couldn't even read or write. So there was some interesting things. The sad thing is that some of those that were in with us, Christadelphians, they were prepared to die for what they believed then, but they left the truth later. The long haul is harder than a short period of persecution. The world drips away every day. So we were lawn keepers, John Mansfield and I together. So as time went by and the Lieutenant Colonel became more confident with us, they actually gave us weekend leave. Okay, we had to be back at 12 o'clock Sunday night. And we always arrived there 1 minute to 12 on a Sunday night. By and large, we had it reasonable, but then a new lot of soldiers would come in and you'd go through the process of them rejecting you, then getting used to you and then deciding you're not so stupid after all. And it was interesting walking round, going to and from our huts to do our work and that. You'd pass by a group that were getting instruction by a padre who was brainwashing the soldiers that murder's wrong, but it's all right to kill. This isn't murder. And he was giving them long sessions of up to an hour and a half, different, a group of 100 young men at a time, pumping into them that it was right to kill. And we would watch them in training with their bayonets fixed and screaming down the paddock and pushing it into the bags and all that. That's the part the padre had to play apart from his ordinary duties, was to orient the men morally to be killers. And many of them were genuine in their beliefs and views, okay, but of course we didn't go along with that. So eventually our time came up and we were given a certificate of release and we just left for home. But after being home a while, along in the mail comes a cheque for the whole period for your wages, which we politely sent back, and they sent us a receipt from Consolidated Revenue for that time. So all that period on the books we were privates and they paid us accordingly, which we sent back. JWs took it all. They said they were spoiling the Egyptians. So they took the money and every advantage. When there was a concert, Emil, who was their head man and a good JW, he'd get up there with his guitar and play all the latest tunes for the soldiers' whirlings. I was very disappointed in them. Some of our own boys left the truth later. So that was the experience. From there on, we got involved in organising the cases better due to the work of Bruce Phillip first, then Ted Sponberg, and then they co-opted me as a junior partner. I had no problem with it because I was fairly, at that stage I was baptised and very dedicated to it, and I didn't involve myself in any worldly things, and I was committed to the meetings plus and preaching the mainland and endeavouring to do the right thing all the time. I wasn't self-righteous about it, but I was trying, and I didn't have any trouble with the court. They didn't accuse me of any inconsistencies in my conduct in any way, whereas many of them did suffer that, unfortunately, especially those who weren't committed and unbaptised were sort of in between. They believed they shouldn't go to war, but they were still sort of having a good time in the world, or they really they were given a hard time in the court, as they should have been, as they should have been. We instilled that in the boys over 10 years, the need for absolute consistency of conduct. The truth's got to be something of the heart. They've got to know their answers, yeah, but they've got to live privately what they confess with their mouth, otherwise it's useless. And otherwise they're in court on a false premise because they're not genuine. And that's what the courts are really looking for. They're looking for a genuine conscience. That is a good magistrate. We got an easier time with Catholic magistrates because they believed in doing what the church told you, whether you understood it or not. They tended to let the boys off, which wasn't good. Your church said that. Your church are conscientious objectors. You belong to that church. You're a bona fide member of that church, and they let you off. But those who weren't that way inclined, they were more rational and more consistent, and their questions were very searching. The commandment not to kill also goes along with all the other commandments, to be in the world but not of it. For all that's in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. It's going to pass away. But only the word endures forever. So young people have got to make sure they use the days of their youth, when their brain is at its greatest capacity to learn, to remember their Creator in those days and commence the life of dedication from there, not only to be able to present their faith in the court, but that ultimately to present themselves before the great court of the judgment seat of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Sister Margaret Pulley speaks of her memories, and she remembers her Brother John Mansfield, and her dad being involved, Brother James Mansfield, and also has some comments on Brother Bruce Philp, Sr.
A lot of it is about Bruce Philp, but because it was so outstanding. I was so glad afterwards that I'd been there. It was a time when I don't think it would be easy for people that have lived now to realise how it's almost nerve-wracking. Even when you know you're not going to be taken in, it's still going to involve those from your family or from others that you know so well at the meeting. It really makes it very difficult to even realise that you've got to live through this part and recognise that other brethren in the early days suffered in the same way. We weren't, of course, put to the difficulties that may be ahead for sisters in the future. We accept the fact that because you were very careful about what position you were going to take, where you couldn't be involved that for anything that looked as though you were happy about the fighting, you were really regarded as a complete traitor to your country. It wasn't very nice even at school, places like that. Other girls whose brothers or cousins were involved in the war. One of my friends at school, on the day we took the first subject of the higher school certificate, they received the telegram to say that her brother had died in action, and she couldn't take the exam. She was so upset about it, and yet it was her best subject, and we all felt very, very sad that that could happen, and you also had the nervousness of feeling that somebody was going to say to you, well, you're not involved, you're one of these conscientious objectors. And it does make you, and gives you a little bit of a nervous outlook, really. The only thing I can remember was that the lady down the street kept an eye on me because she knew I should be working for the government, and my father was very careful to try and make sure that we weren't involved. So he enlisted us as his employee, which made it very easy. And this lady, of course, kept suspecting that I wasn't going because I used to go and do shopping for Mother in the wrong hours, or from her point of view. And I used to keep a watch out all the time, and if I saw her coming, I used to be so nervous because, of course, Dad was always very strict anyway, that we always spoke very politely to everybody. Particularly in this situation too, I think it's the one thing he impressed on the young people, and I have mentioned that you couldn't take liberties, as Dad used to say, with your protocol of the court cases, which two young brethren didn't realise how serious it was, and one was threatened with being charged with contempt of the court. I really know the surname of the young brethren. They lived in the country, lived out of Sydney, and Dad, of course, always got involved because they knew that Dad would go with them and would also speak to them beforehand. But, of course, being away, it wasn't quite so easy. But I did not witness this. When Dad used to come home of a night and had been at the courts, we all wanted to know how everything had gone and what they'd said. And this particular time, one of these young brethren who were on the land, the brother came with him just to support him, but the younger one had been called up. He was really involved most of the time during the war. You see, the war finished in 1945, and he would go with anybody at all. At the same time, the Central Standing Committee did appoint a Mr. Francis. He was a lawyer. I don't know whether I should say this, but Dad felt that a man who's a lawyer doesn't quite understand the Christadelphian situation. He was never really particularly happy about that happening, because he said when you're a Christadelphian too, you know exactly the way you feel about it and how you should reply. And therefore he wasn't terribly happy about that. There were other brethren, of course, that were adamant that they must have legal support. He didn't really like it, though. I know when the judge would do what he did, for instance, for Alan, he'd call out to Mr. Mansfield, is this one of your boys? That's what, when they got to know him very well. Later on, Dad himself was called up, because as the war progresses, they go with the older group and as the people are getting killed off and they need more soldiers, and therefore they'll extend the age group. At first, Dad was not called up. Later, he was called up. And I can still remember he was completely, prepared himself by what he was going to say and things like that. But the judge knew him so well through the others, he almost took it as though incredible that he could be called up when he had been helping all these others, and gave him exemption almost straight away. And Dad was a little bit sad about that. He felt that he wasn't giving a good example to the other young lads to think that he got off so quickly. At the time, too, I might just mention, he was in the, as you know, you probably know that he had the business that was with Captain Salmon and sardines and all of that. Now, anything like that is very difficult to maintain in wartime, because boats go down to the bottom of the ocean, they're torpedoed, so that he wasn't getting the his what he required in the salmon and sardines and herrings and all that line. They weren't coming through, so his business dropped off. And then the Department of Supply took over his building for the duration of the war. So he really had nowhere to store anything anyway. And that was at Alexandria. So he moved all his books and everything like that to our home, and had them all in a room at home there. Well, we all loved to hear what he'd heard that day. If it was anything, we thoroughly enjoyed it all, of course. And of course, Mother always supported Dad. She was one of these older generation ladies who did exactly everything. There was never ever an argument, or we never ever heard anything between Mother and Dad. They were always at one, really. It was frustrating to children, because we'd say, can I go home with my friend from Sunday school, and Dad would always say, go and ask your mother, and Mother would say the same thing. We could never get an answer. I suppose there's no way I'd have felt as nervous as the young man, but at times, particularly when Bruce was speaking this time and was stopped by the judge because he was going too quickly for the shorthand writer. And then when Bruce's reaction, I immediately thought, oh dear, it made you nervous for fear that the judge would criticise him for his action, because Bruce was really incredible. He'd been going for his life. Dad had spoken to him and said, look, we haven't got anybody, none of the Christadelphians under this judge has been granted exemption. So he said, what I want you to do, Bruce, I want you to think up every verse and every incident that you can in the lives of the people in the scriptures, or any verse you can think of that would help in our situation, and just keep going. Don't worry about time, keep going. Well, Bruce did exactly that. As you know, that was right. Exactly what he loved doing was keep going, and he could talk and talk and talk. And when we got home, I said to Mother, that was like several exhortations and lectures and expositions all rolled into one, because he went for his life. But the judge stopped him, I think it was about halfway through the afternoon, and said, look, Mr. Philp, the shorthand writer can't keep up with you. You'll have to cut down your speed. Anyway, Bruce didn't even reply. He just put his hands up to his face like that and just was like that. And there was dead silence. And you could have heard a pin drop because everybody's just looking at him. There was no answer. He looked like that. And then he said, "Your Honour, you've destroyed my train of thought." I'll never forget those words as long as I live. It was just the way he said them. But he did say, too, at the end, that because of what this man has demonstrated, that he has a conscientious objection. In other words, I don't really quite go along with everything, but I've got to agree that he's got the conscientious objection. He went on after that, just as fast. It never changed him at all. It's very easy for me to give advice, but it's very hard to put things into your life yourself. You know what I mean when you're in the situation. But if you could possibly think, I think that verse that Jesus said, "Don't be afraid of those who can only kill you. Be afraid, fear God." That's the one. And if you could only think that it doesn't matter if anything serious crops up. You've got God behind you. Think, look, things are in God's hands. I can't worry about it because He's in control, and it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. But it would be lovely to be able to do that all the time, but it's not always easy. If you could try and think about it, even when you don't have problems, perhaps it'll grow on you and you won't worry. But it's very hard. Yes.
Brother John Pooley recalls his experiences.
Firstly, I think I appeared before the ordinary magistrate. He ruled against me. I then had the right of appeal. I forget how many appeals I went through. I went through at least one appeal. I forget whether there were more than one. I think Mr. Francis was employed by, if I remember the name, was employed as a solicitor. The big thing that went against me was that I was employed at the Maritime Services Board at the time. Quite a few of our brethren were. Brother Mulgate helped a lot of us get the job when we were in our teenagers. Our brother L.C. Mulgate, you've probably heard of him before, one of the elders at Regent Hall. But the reason given for my rejection was it was considered that I was inconsistent because I worked at the Maritime Services, which at the time, of course, controlled not only ordinary shipping but all sorts of shipping, and therefore it was assumed that the warships and all. But in the judgment of the judge or court, he thought it was inconsistent, so that's why I got the sentence. A sentence of a month. I think it was only a month from memory. In Long Bay, they had a farm, growing produce and so forth there, and we went out there each day. The fellow we had in charge of us, he had a son or two in the forces, and he was not very sympathetic. He didn't. He wasn't very, very hard manager, but I explained to him the situation and my belief and why I believed it from the scripture and so forth. And it was my belief, a real genuine belief, and he came to accept me after a while. He came to treat me rather well. I had a good training at Regent Hall. I had a good understanding of things, and also I developed enough confidence to reply and to give the reasons. And
Brother John Mansfield, who was in with Brother David Pogson, tells us about his experiences during the Second World War.
We were very, very fortunate because the boys that went up, they would call up either 10 o'clock, as the court in the morning, or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The boys that went up at 10 o'clock, they went straight to Victoria Barracks, and then the military police would take them out to Holsworthy, and they would say to you, well, we want you to take the gun and the uniform and so forth. And they would then, refuse to do that, and then they were sent straight to the corrective establishment. But they'd got so many people that, in there that I came up in the afternoon, so I spent the night at Victoria Barracks in the jail. And then the next day, the military police picked me up and took me up there. So, but in between, they said, we've got too many in the corrective. Was filling it up totally. So they made it think, well, we're not going to send you there anymore. And they actually threatened me. They said, well, you'll probably go back to the courts and then go to Long Bay Jail, which never eventuated. That was December 54. So I was around the camp for a fortnight because the commanding officer was away on holidays. A very nice person. He was from the British Army, and he'd been transferred to the Australian Army, but he was a very decent man, and the different arrangements that we came to, he honoured them right through to the end. Like, no, we didn't have to we just wore our own clothing. We didn't have to accept the military pay, the reveille, like first thing in the morning, everyone had to be up at 6 o'clock and they'd all parade sort of thing. We didn't have to do that. And he, right through to the end, he was very, very... so really we couldn't really complain, like our group, with the treatment at all. It was very, very... There were times where others would try and intimidate you, but one time they brought us all into the headquarters of the company, you know, these different companies in the camp sort of thing. The company that we were actually accommodated in, they brought us all in there and they said, right, from now on, you're going to take the military pay. And there were Jehovah's Witnesses in there, who had got in there on the same basis that we'd arranged. And they wanted, that was quite all right to take the military pay sort of thing. But we just went to because he would come in and talk to you while we'd do gardening work. Me and David were actually just worked a little team together. And he would come like in the morning and he'd chat away to us, and we would have that opportunity to say to him, well, look, this is what had been put to us, and that really is not and he said, oh, no, I'll see to that. And he would always do it so that we were very, very well treated, really. There was nothing... there was nothing really that we could sort of say that there was no real harsh circumstances that we really went through at all. Now, I think they did respect, particularly this commanding officer. He was a lieutenant colonel, and I think we said, look, we're not here to break the rules, but we've got a conscience about these things, and that's why we're doing this. And we did, at first we had to weed this area where they were going to plant lawn and some shrubs and so forth. And even though it got pretty hot out there, we kept going all the time, and they would say, oh, come in out of the heat, for an hour or two. But we'd go and perhaps have a cup of tea, and then we'd go back to the job again. And I think they realised that, well, we weren't just there because we wanted to, we didn't want to go into the army, but we were prepared to do what we could. The preparation really was fairly inadequate, actually. There was not very much. It was the old CSC days, and they really relied more on getting a solicitor and paying a solicitor to represent us in the courts. I know that then did change later on. There was not a lot of really preparation for appearing in the courts. When I personally went up to the Court of Petty Sessions, because you would naturally apply for exemption, and then they would call you up before the Court of Petty Sessions. And the day that I went up, the magistrate that had been hearing the cases was on holidays, and this chap that filled in for him, he had been a prisoner of war, and I think he'd lost one or two of his sons in the war, and I think he saw us as really we're just cowards, that's all he could see in us, because he'd been involved in the war. And actually, my dad, who had represented quite a number of the boys, and he knew that the reaction of this magistrate, and so he asked the solicitor who was appearing on our behalf to get the case adjourned. And I think because he'd found that virtually every case was was given exemption, he thought that, oh, there's nothing to worry about type of thing. But Dad knew that this one, say 12 months before, when he'd filled in for the magistrate, that he'd not given exemption then. There was no sort of classes or anything like that. From memory, I think it was just sort of I don't know whether we even had any, written material that we would study. I think that really came. They would generally bring. My dad was the main one at that time. They would then say, "Well, Mr. Mansfield, is this boy a bona fide Christadelphian?" And he would say, "Yes." Well, I've got every. I'm very, very pleased with him. He's shaping up well in the meeting and so forth. And preparation was not, I think that would come out. I haven't actually got the transcripts of our case before Kerr Lewis. But, when I look back, we weren't really very convincing, I don't think, really. And for someone that was really not in favour of people getting out of military training, it didn't probably, probably wasn't far wrong with some of the comments that he made, really. Although he was very, very, very harsh man, Kerr Lewis particularly. And as he says in his summing up, he just saw us as really cowards, and the Christadelphian movement generally, he really incorporated us all together. I didn't get an exemption at all. Some did give them, say, non-combatant, like exemption from military service, but were supposedly to do non-combatant work. But I didn't get any exemption at all. Just straight out. There was two of us, I think. I just remember. I forget who the other brother was that was also had the same, and. Mr. Henderson said, "Well, you've taken these 5 boys as one. You haven't like individually judged them. You've made them as one, and yet you've allowed 3 boys with non-combatant exemption, and 2 boys you haven't given them anything." And he said, "Well, be careful what you say, otherwise I'll take the not that mattered really, but the exemption from the 3 boys, I'll take that off them and as well." So that he certainly was not acting the part of a judge really in the true sense, because that's definitely the case. Like as Dad knew, if I go up to there, I'm not going to get exemption, sort of thing. But that was. As I say, we're not. I suppose we're away from our families for 4.5 months, sort of thing. But with us, fortunately, we got every Sunday we had off. We go to the meeting. They'd give us a leave from Saturday evening about 5 o'clock, and then we didn't have to get back till midnight on Sunday. And we virtually had the. We could have actually got, and in fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses they'd go out to the pictures at night. We say, well, that's a little bit inconsistent. You're here on conscience, and you go to the pictures, which was against the arrangement type of thing. You were there for the full time unless you got a leave pass from them, and then they would sit down in the theatre. They wouldn't stand up for the national anthems. We were very well treated. Like there was actually this Bruce Maxwell. He was sent to Ingleburn, and there was a very difficult sergeant major sort of thing there, and he was he was really very. He virtually had a breakdown, I think, because it was just so difficult. I think then eventually they did switch him over to the detention centre at Holsworthy. Well, again, because we were able to, I'd be back with a family sort of thing virtually every weekend for that, like Saturday night to Sunday night. But like brothers and sisters were very pleased to hear of the experiences and so forth. Yes, naturally because I had a family, we get together, of course, out of that break each week. Well, probably the first thing is that you've got to become well and truly involved in the ecclesial activities, because that is one point that they do, stress. What are you doing on the weekends? Are you involved in like religious work and so forth? So I think that's probably the most important. But then following that, to certainly develop a mind or like a thinking on the principles from the scriptures. I think that's probably the next, which is tied in with the first point, really, isn't it? And I guess that's probably the two main factors, really, because it certainly does help if you've got that background when you go before the courts, because I think they felt, oh, well, this has all been learnt, type of thing, and this has been presented that way. I think that's important, but I think the other is probably more important, that you can document that, well, this is the type of life I'm living. I'm spending quite a good percentage of my life involved in ecclesial activities, because that is naturally, that's something that's impressing the magistrate more than the fact of being adequate. And they would often say, oh, do you go to class and say, you've got to be careful, haven't you, with, like this is in later cases, it was certainly not with us. We had no problem with that at all. I suppose they've got to be careful that people say, well, if you become a Christadelphian,
you can get out of it.
And they've got to sort of make sure that it's a sincere. And I think that's why they would ask, well, what's your activities? Do you go to a Bible class? Oh, well, no, not really. Well, when do you go? The problem with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I think it really eventually that stopped that, because I think the army saw that, well, they really didn't show much conscience at all. But that probably went for, I think that just my recollection could have been, perhaps it may have kept going the same way for about 12 months. Like we had our cars there, like, and you'd drive off when we'd have the leave, sort of thing. They were very, very helpful to us, really. But I think the big thing which probably they appreciated was the fact that we didn't say, well, we're off on a holiday and we're going to just take it easy. We sort of kept going all the time, and they would sort of see that, well, yes, you have got a conscience about these things. You're prepared to put it into action. There was quite a tension really there. I think that the law system sort of seems to generate that, doesn't it, in people? Fortunately, this was really, like, after the war, I think they'd felt it was wise to keep it going. That's right, because who knows what was going to happen, type of thing. Yeah. And of course, then it came back again for the, I think the Korean War, wasn't it? And then for the Vietnam War. I think Vietnam, was the first time that they actually sent national service chaps to the war, which would have been very difficult. And that was more if your birthday fell on a certain, like, dates during the year, you would be called up, and then you would have to. So it'd only be those ones that their birthday fell in that particular time that they would have to naturally. I can't remember really just how things went in the courts in those times. I think really the courts were probably given some direction from higher up that, particularly probably in that case, that, these, we really don't want these chaps if they're not, we're not willing to pull their weight, sort of thing. What's the good of trying to force them to do it, sort of thing, Yes, well, because it could be, well, not could be, it would be girls as well, wouldn't it, Whereas before it was only men that were involved. But these days there's no, there's no distinction really in the eyes of the government, really.